Hi, Philadelphia. I'm Elliot Ratzman of Earlham College, a longtime friend of the festival. I'm happy to be with you here. And we have with us Joe Kolman and Elana Sigall, the director and producer of An Unorthodox Education. So Joe, Elana, I'd like for you to introduce yourself to the Philadelphia audience. Who are you? What have you been up to? And how did you get to this point of producing and directing An Unorthodox Education?
Thank you. I've been a journalist off and on for many years, and a young woman stayed with us who had from a ultra-Orthodox background when she was trying to get her BA. She worked with a group called Footsteps, and we had her in an extra bedroom in our house while our kids were going to college. She told us these horror stories about what it was like to be ultra-Orthodox and to leave the community, and how difficult it was for her to get an education. And later on, when I became a filmmaker, I decided I was going to do a short documentary about this. We've been working on this for about a year and a half. It went from an 8-minute documentary to now a 30-minute documentary. And then I interviewed quite a few people, and I brought on Elana Sigall, who's my producer, who's a legal expert, and she can explain things from her perspective too.
Elliot, thank you so much for doing this. I am a lawyer by training, but I work really in education policy and education consulting. And I consult with corporations, with individuals, with families, with nonprofits. And part of the work that I do is that I do advise people who are choosing to leave the ultra-Orthodox community and want to find new schools and educational opportunities for themselves and for their kids. Joe called me when he was working on the film and asked to interview me, and we worked together, and sort of things led to things, and I got more involved with the film, with the background work on the film. I have clients that I've worked with who are in the movie. And I have been working with a lot of different groups on the issue of what it means to get an education in 2021 in the United States.
Elana, you have a long and very interesting work history. Might you tell our audience what you've been doing over the last few decades?
As I mentioned, I was a lawyer, and I am a lawyer. I have done legal work in a variety of capacities, but I've sort of moved over to having more of a policy role. I was the governor's education advisor in New York, Governor Cuomo. I also was a senior policy advisor for New York City in the area of special education. I served as a special master internally for the New York City Department of Ed at one time on a big class action that they were working on. So I have a lot of different kinds of experience in policy, and also in working with schools and with families.
I'd like to get to some of the substantial issues the film raises. Now, the way that the film frames it, it seems that some of the names on those letters obstructing the investigation of the yeshivas were liberal, even progressive Democratic politicians. The film suggests that liberal progressive politicians around New York had been dragging their feet or turning a blind eye to some of the shenanigans going on. Could you explain to us why that is? It seems counterintuitive.
I think it really has nothing to do with progressive principles or liberal principles. I think it has to do with pure corruption and votes and just power, really. De Blasio, for whatever his political views are, he needs to get reelected. And he knows that the only way to get reelected in the first place was to pander to the Haredi vote. And the Haredi vote in New York City is about 100,000 votes. And in order to get elected in the Democratic primary with so many different people fighting for that position, he ran right to the top because he had this enormous amount of votes from the Haredi community, and he got reelected with the same amount of votes. And in the most recent election, we saw exactly the same thing. So the ideology has nothing to do with it. These people know what's going. I believe these people, these liberal, quote, liberal progressive politicians, know what's going on, but they are refusing to recognize the truth out of a sheer desire to get elected and to hold on to their power. And I don't see anything more than that.
I would just add to that also that I think one of the issues that we have seen and that I've encountered in doing this work is that there is the issue of the block vote, and we've seen that, and it's not partisan at all. It's whoever is going to, serve particular interests. But there is also something that we have seen in New York City, and we're starting to see a change, I think, which is that the public does not really understand this issue. And I think that to a large extent, that includes the politicians. I have been in a lot of schools. Most politicians have not. Most people have not. And they make certain assumptions. And this is a Jewish film festival, and I know that part of the work that you're doing is promoting work that is based in Jewish values. And I think there is a Jewish value around education that the public has accepted and understood and sort of assumed. And I think that there's an idea that if a school is Jewish or if education is based in Judaism, that it must mean that it's championing intellectual pursuits and academic pursuits. And I think that's an assumption that a lot of people have. I think that people have kind of assumed that one yeshiva is the same as another yeshiva, is the same as a day school, and people haven't really drilled down into it. I can say in some of the work that I do, even people who purport to be very close to this, when I identify things that I have seen happening in certain schools, they're astounded. I think it's just something that, and I think that's part of the power of the film, is that even if you sort of think you knew something about it, it's shocking when you actually hear what some of the people have experienced and how little they learned in school.
So what are you hoping that the film will instigate? And let me ask, at the end of the film, that some of those important officials did not respond or get back to you with comments. Has there been any reaction since the film has been completed? Has anything shifted or anyone changed their tune?
This film has not been widely distributed yet, so I don't know how many of the people who have seen the film, and we don't know what any kind of reaction has been. But we're certainly hopeful that my goal, I mean, I don't want to speak for Elana, but my goal is to see that perhaps some politicians who have been allowing this miscarriage of justice to continue because they're either turning a blind eye or they're actively ignoring the issue will think twice about it. And I also think that there might be a groundswell of hope to ignite some sort of groundswell of support or pressure on the people in power who actually make the decisions, and maybe the next mayoral administration to really address this issue, because it's a scandal that has not yet received the full media attention it deserves.
Yeah, I think we want to shine a light on it, and for people to really see and understand what's happening, because these things have consequences not just for the people inside those communities, but for the people who live outside of those communities and near those communities. And in New York City, 6 feet of social distancing notwithstanding, we live in very close quarters. And so when you are living near people who conduct their lives and their communities in particular ways, it has effects on all of us. And so one of the things that I'm hoping is that more people who sort of see this community from afar and think to themselves, oh, those are the Amish people of New York City, isn't that great? That they actually take an interest in what's going on in those communities and see how those communities, the actions in those communities, for example, when that community refused to get vaccinated for the measles, there was an outbreak of the measles in Brooklyn. That affects all of us. So I think that, I'm hoping that people start to recognize that. I also, I teach courses, I have for many years at Columbia, at Teachers College, and at the law school, and my courses focus a lot on equity issues in education, and it's something I care a lot about. And I think this is a huge equity issue in education that we need to address as a community and as a city and as a society.
In my mind, it's very much a social justice issue.
Yes.
It's civil rights in the best sense of the word. These are civil rights that kids deserve. They deserve to be educated, and it's a different kind of civil rights struggle.
So let me push back a bit on some of the claims of the film. Now, I was outraged at the injustices and some of the shenanigans that you brought to light, as anyone I think should be. But comparing the ultra-Orthodox to other enclave communities, for example, I'm thinking about the Amish here in the Midwest where I'm at, and I'm wondering about the legal parallels between the Amish as an enclave community and the ultra-Orthodox. But I'm also thinking about Native Americans who were made to conform in a very cruel and destructive way. They were made to conform to European norms by forcing Native children to go to school. Now, what if a Native tribe didn't want to educate its children in secular Western culture, but were forced to conform? We would all call this colonialism, to rob the Native culture of its integrity, to impose different norms and expectations. So why can't we see the ultra-Orthodox with a bit of sympathy, the way we might give to the Amish or to Native Americans? That is a right not to be colonized by modernity and secularism.
Glad you asked that. Obviously, I mentioned the Amish earlier, hoping that I would maybe spark a question. There is a landmark Supreme Court case about education in the Amish world. And I think many legal scholars, the case is from the early 1970s, and I think many legal scholars believe that if the case were brought now, it might have a different outcome. But putting that aside, the case was very narrow, and it was about whether or not the state could compel Amish children to go to school between the ages of 14 and 16. There was a compulsory education law in Wisconsin that required kids to be in school till age 16. All 50 states have a compulsory education law. The ages vary from state to state, but Wisconsin's was 16. And the community was not asking for the kids to be excused from school entirely. They were just asking for them to be excused essentially from the 2 years of high school that they would have to attend to meet with the compulsory education standards. And the court said that, they have a compelling interest in making sure that the citizens of this country and of the state of Wisconsin are educated, but that the 14 to 16, 2 years was not important enough to overcome the Amish's right to free exercise of their religion. There are really stark differences, though, between what's happening in the Hasidic and certain yeshivish communities in New York City and what was happening in the Amish community in Wisconsin. And the court the court noted, and I think this is a really important piece, that one of the reasons that they weren't concerned about compelling more education for the Amish was that the community is, or at least was at that time, entirely self-sufficient. Did not rely on, it was an agricultural community, it was self-supporting, did not rely on any government support, did not end up entangled in the criminal justice system in any way, that it was a really self-sufficient community, so that the isolation that the community was asking for was something that they were able to sustain. That is not the case with the communities in New York City. Those communities depend for their survival on government money. And that is, not really taken up in our film, but it is the case that about half of the community is living in poverty. There's a huge amount of reliance on the government for food, healthcare, shelter, and even the schools themselves get funding, government funding, in a variety of ways. So that's, I think, one big difference. I also think that we aren't, and I take the point that, we don't want to be colonizing anyone. But we are talking about children. So it's a little bit tricky. These are not adults who are making the decision not to be educated. They're children, and the adults are making those decisions for them. And in fact, famously, the dissent in the Amish case, the Yoder case I mentioned, one of the justices said, hey, it would have been really nice to hear from some of the kids. And I think in a way, that's what our movie is about. It's like, let's hear from some of the kids. They're adults now, so we can film them, but let's hear what they might have wanted. And I think we have to think seriously about what kind of baseline education or skills that somebody needs, not to live a lifestyle that's uniform with the rest of us, not to be part entirely of secular society if that's not what you choose, but to have enough that you have choices. And I think what we really found, and what Joe found in talking to so many subjects over the course of the filming, is that people didn't feel like they had choices, and they're now in a situation where they've been constrained in their lives by not having really sort of basic skills. We're talking in some cases about people who don't know how to write their own names in English.
So I am reminded of an argument that atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett made, where he asked the question, why do adults determine at all a child's religion? Why not let a child choose their religion at some point? As a religious studies professor, I find this line of thinking absurd, but it raises a very deep question about autonomy. How deep does autonomy go? Or should we accept that we all grow up in contexts and cultures not of our choosing, eventually with options to leave, options to exit, but only at a certain age? How would you respond to this question of autonomy? That is, don't we all have very limited say in how we are raised? So what did not make it into the documentary? Maybe for legal or artistic purposes or reasons, what didn't make it into the film? When the Blu-ray version debuts, what will be some of the extras that we would get to see that you left on the cutting room floor?
Wow, no one has really asked me that question. So Elliot, so thank you so much for asking that, because this is a 30-minute film and we could have done 90 minutes if we had the money. We did not have the money. And there's so much about women, for instance, that we can get to. that we might want to get to in another iteration of this, if everything works out. There's not just the yeshiva world. I'm sorry, the Hasidic world. There's other sects in ultra-Orthodoxy. We call it the yeshivish world and others like that. And things are a little bit different than some of the Hasidic women we've seen. But the women's issue was, we could not get to it as much as we could. And there's also issues of fraud and government support and all these other things that we'd like to get to. And we might get to if things work out. We'll see. Elana,
we could do a series, you know?
Yeah, we could if we had the money. Yeah.
I am a connoisseur of memoirs by people who have left their religion, former Amish, former Westboro Baptist Church, former Mormon, former ultra-Orthodox Jews. We know that formerly Orthodox or people are a tantalizing subject for projects. For example, Netflix's Unorthodox. What do you have to say about this?
One of the directors you're referring to contacted us and wanted us to expand this into a series, but the idea of trying to get 5 ex-Hasidic kids and follow them through 3 or 4 years was way beyond what we could do.
So I'd like to bring this conversation to a close by saying how important the work you are doing on the legal front, amplifying these problems, how important this work is. I hope that the harm and suffering that you've brought to light is reduced and that justice is served because of your efforts. What will you be working on next on either the cinematic or the legal front?
I'll speak for myself real quickly. I'd like to get this film in front of more politicians in New York City and convince more people to help them understand the issue. And Elana, of course, has been working on this for much longer than I have, and will continue working on this longer than I ever will.
I want to also just say that, you know, we're doing the work from the perspective of the film. There are other people who are working on all different aspects of this. And there's a big advocacy group in New York that's bringing litigation. There are groups that are providing, there's one main group, Footsteps, Joe mentioned, that provides services to people who are thinking about leaving or might want to leave, who need support of various kinds. YAFED does a lot of the advocacy work and the legal work. So I just want to make sure people know that there are some very organized, committed people out there who are working on these issues. And there are all different kinds of ways to get involved in this issue if you're interested.
And one more thing I want to mention, just to the people in Philadelphia, the problems that we saw in this film are quite localized in many respects to Brooklyn and upstate New York. And the yeshivas elsewhere in the country generally give their kids a much better secular education than they receive here in Brooklyn and in upstate communities like that you've seen in our film. So we don't want to leave people with the impression that all yeshivas don't, you know, are doing this. So please understand that.
I think that's a really good point. We're talking about a very specific subset of schools, and they don't have a different name necessarily than the other ones. So we want to make sure there's not confusion.
That's a really important point, that yeshivas in other locations do conform to standards. When you compare the cultures of yeshiva education in different places, we see how deficient New York is. That's a really important argument, and it illustrates well the injustice that you all have brought to light. We are thrilled to have this film in our lineup, and I want to wish you two all the best and Godspeed with your efforts. Thank you for being in this festival.
Thanks for showing the film, and I hope lots of people see it and get a fire put under them.